Good morning to everyone. Let us begin today with Professor Ake, the Dean of the Faculty, who will provide welcome remarks, and then we'll proceed. อาจารย์เอกครับเชิญครับ
Excellencies, distinguished participants, good morning to everyone. I have a pleasure of welcoming you to ISIS Public Forum on Thailand, Southeast Asia, between United States and China. Dilemmas, options, and prospects. The ongoing geopolitical and geo-economic rivalry and the competition between United States and China have adversely affected the regional order and balance among Southeast Asia states and government, and ASEAN as their regional cooperation vehicle. No Southeast Asian state appears inclined to choose one superpower over the other. All would rather hedge and leverage between the two superpower giants to cope and navigate their way forward. But as the US and China confrontation intensifies, these two superpowers may eventually compel the regional states to pick a side. How should Southeast Asia respond? More specifically, how should Thailand react in view of its treaty alliance with the US and intimate ties with China? Addressing both Southeast Asia as a whole and Thailand on its own in their interaction and response to superpower competition and conflict. This public forum brings together the established panel of experts and scholars to discuss salient issues and challenges as their development in the US-China face-off unfold in the months ahead. This forum also timely occasion as Thailand has just hosted the 35th ASEAN Summit and the 14th East Asia Summit. I am sure the speakers will tease out some of the highlights from the ASEAN-related summits in their presentation. For example, we saw earlier this year the launch of the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, but unfortunately, we did not see the finalization of the regional comprehensive economic partnership before the end of this year, but we are supposed to see it next year. Let me thank to all the speakers, Dr. Anne Maria Murphy, visiting senior fellow of ISIS Thailand, and the Director Center of the Emerging Powers and Transitional Trends, School of Diplomatic and International Relations, Seton University. Mr. Benjamin Zawacki, political and legal consultant, the author of the Thailand's shifting ground between the US and the rising China, and Ajahn Wasana Wongsurawat, lecturer from the Department of History, Faculty of Arts from here at Chulalongkorn University, and Kavi Chongkittavorn, our senior fellow and columnist of the Bangkok Post. So let me return the floor to Ajahn Tinan, and then I hope you enjoy these proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you. ขอบคุณครับอาจารย์เอก Welcome to everyone. I want to begin by apologizing for the a little bit of logistical barriers. Perhaps we have some renovation taking place around our faculty, so I think some of you have maybe got a little bit detoured. The next event that we have will be back in the Faculty of Arts on November 28th. It will be on the Mekong region, so there's a different venue, not road renovation there. Today we have a very timely topic. I want to say a little bit of the background context for it. So this is something that we're doing after the ASEAN-related summits. We deliberately chose a date that would be after the summit, and there's been some drama during the summit. And of course, President Trump did not come, and this year I think ASEAN has come out with the AOIP, ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. We had a seminar earlier about that. No RCEP yet this year, and perhaps we will have RCEP 15, not 16, without India. Next year we will find out the final shape and form of RCEP. In addition, we're doing it today because this topic and occasion, because I want to take advantage of a visiting professor from the US, Professor Anne-Marie Murphy from Seton University. Dr. Professor Murphy is here to do research on Thai-US relations and on more broadly also US-Southeast Asia relations. So, she's with us only for a few weeks. So I want to make sure that we have her here while she's here. And then, of course, we have Benjamin Zawacki. He's written a book on the subject. I'll introduce him later, and you should also have their bios already with you. And he will speak a little bit about US, China, Thailand within it. So Professor Murphy will kind of lay the ground with Thailand, Southeast Asia, US, China. President Trump did not come to Bangkok, to Nonthaburi, to Thailand, but he's invited ASEAN leaders to the US within the first quarter of 2020. This is going to be a big dilemma for ASEAN, whether to go or not to go. Going will incur some risks and present some opportunities, but also not going also risks and opportunities. So I think maybe we'll start this way, and U.S. What's the game plan? This year, the U.S. Delegation has even lowered a bit more from Trump, President Trump in 2017, Vice President Pence in 2018, 2019 was Special Envoy, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien with Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. And next year, I don't know who they will send after this year. But at the same time, the U.S. has a free and open Indo-Pacific geostrategy that we have been working with in the region. This is something that, in fact, was peddled, was given a big boost by President Trump's visit in 2017. So it's a bit of a surprise and I think a bit of a disappointment to many in the neighborhood in Southeast Asia that President Trump did not come because we're grappling with the kind of geostrategic framework that he set on the table back in 2017. So perhaps we can invite you first, Professor Murphy. Thailand, not just Southeast Asia, but also Thailand in particular, if we can pitch it that way. And then US, China, US having elections next year. President Trump has invited ASEAN leaders. Not easy for all 10 ASEAN leaders to go to the US. If the US comes here for the summit season, it's just one person, right? One leader. ASEAN goes to the US, it's 10 leaders. So they have to find a schedule that is in sync to be available for that. So I don't know if this will happen. Professor Murphy.
Thank you very much, Jay, for that very kind introduction, and to Ajahn Ake for his lead-in as well. What I'm going to do is kind of address the topic of the panel, which is Thailand, Southeast Asia, between obviously the US and China, dilemmas, options, and prospects. As an academic, I can tell you that the consensus among policymakers and in all of the IR literature is that the most stable environment for smaller and medium powers like those in Southeast Asia is one of a rough balance of power or equilibrium. The most dangerous one is when you have the case of rising powers. Not because rising powers in and of themselves create conflict, but because they tend to want to change the international system in accord with their interests and in line with what they believe their newfound power, economic wealth, and prestige entitle them to. This, of course, brings them into into potential conflict with existing powers like the United States. And what we've seen over the last decade is an intensification of this conflict between the US and China. We've seen President Xi abandon Deng Xiaoping's low-profile, bide your time, hide your strength policy. Instead, as he said, China has stood up, grown rich, and become strong. We've seen President Trump abandon the long-term policy consensus that China was a potential strategic partner and label China a peer competitor. As a result, we see Southeast Asian states compelled to choose sides, but no one wants to. They all want to hedge, as Ajahn Ake indicated. They want to maintain their strategic autonomy. So what Jay had asked me to do was to talk about US policy primarily. So what I want to do is talk just very briefly about what came before Trump, which was Obama's pivot, talk a little bit about changing US perceptions of China, talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific, and then some kind of options for Southeast Asia, and conclude with some prospects. I'm not going to say that much about some of the more recent events because I thought somebody else was to cover that, but I will a little bit. So what I want to start is from the proposition that Southeast Asian states have always been worried about the U.S. commitment to the region, and Obama's rebalance or pivot policy was designed to address that, okay? It was a multifaceted policy. It had a security component, which was to redeploy naval assets to the Asia Pacific, rotate Marines through Australia's Darwin base, deploy new ships to Singapore. It had an economic component, the TPP, and most importantly, it had a multilateral component. There was a strong commitment to ASEAN. As you all know, under Obama, U.S. signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, joined the EAS, appointed the first resident ambassador to ASEAN, and as Jay indicated, Obama showed up. He invested the most precious commodity that any president has, which is his time. He attended 7 of the 8 summits. And Southeast Asians welcomed the pivot, even if they later complained that it didn't live up to its potential, because it illustrated a commitment to a multifaceted policy to the U.S., helped maintain that overall balance of power, and help them hedge against a rising China. During this time, as I indicated, U.S.-China relations were a mix of cooperation and conflict, but the fundamental assumption underlying U.S. policy was that China, which had grown rich and strong under a global liberal economic order, would seek to change it from within rather than revise it from without, that it was a strategic partner with which the U.S. could cooperate. So what changed? Over the last decade, there was a series of things that led to changing views of the China. In the South China Sea, we see the promulgation of the 9-dash line, where China claims 90% of the South China Sea by virtue of some ambiguous historical claims rather than the UN law of the sea. From the U.S. perspective, this threatens freedom of navigation, its fundamental interest in the region, and it also amounts to an attempt to privatize the global commons. We also see China's seizure of Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012. We see artificial island building, and we see President Xi promise President Obama in a meeting in the Rose Garden of the White House in 2015 that China would not militarize the artificial islands. As we all know, since then, China has constructed airfields, port facilities, hangars, and other things that essentially turn these artificial islands into forward-deployed assets. And the fact that President Xi lied to U.S. policymakers has had a lasting impact on the perceptions of U.S. policymakers, particularly in the security sector. Beyond the South China Sea, we see concerns over trade, cyber espionage, and we also see China, of course, taking initiatives like the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the BRI that were perceived by some in Washington as challenges to Western-led institutions. So in short, even before President Trump's election, we do see a set of factors that were leading to changing perceptions of China. But of course, as we know, President Trump was elected. And since his inauguration, he has adopted a very transactional America First policy. President Trump has a very strong animus towards President Obama and has almost systematically gone about reversing his policies. On one of his first days in office, he withdrew the US from the TPP. And this was a huge blow, particularly to countries like Malaysia and Vietnam, where it was a contentious issue, but reformers had really pushed for it. It was the only time the Malaysian parliament has voted on a free trade agreement because the administration wanted to ensure it had full backing. And so the US withdrawal really harmed the political fortunes of the backers of the TPP, which mostly were political reformers. As you all know, Trump has also adopted a unilateral trade war with China. I don't need to tell this audience that this has disrupted global trade, set back economic growth, and wreaked havoc with global supply chains. And even if some countries like Thailand are seeing some benefits from trade diversion, or investment diversion as a result, we can certainly argue that these countries would have much preferred a stable, rules-based, multilateral order in the global economy. We also see fear that we're going to see a global fragmentation, not only in economic trading system, but also a kind of decoupling in the tech sector over AI. We see that potential with Huawei that will also force Southeast Asian countries to choose sides in a way that they do not. We've seen a fairly assertive foreign economic policy. President Trump is obsessed with deficits. He has a list of the 16 top countries. Thailand is on it. Indonesia is on it. We've seen, obviously, the U.S. withdraw GSP from Thailand. It's also done so to India. Indonesia is on the watch list. This has all generated some backlash. And most importantly, I don't need to reiterate what Jay has already said, you clearly see a reversal of Obama's embrace of multilateralism. With the sending of the low-level delegation, President Trump does not like to travel. Washington right now is very completely focused on domestic politics with the impeachment hearings, implications for the elections, et cetera, and the current Ukrainian and impeachment crisis obviously involves a foreign policy issue with regard to Ukraine. Pompeo has been implicated. So the foreign policy bureaucracy is in a bit of paralysis in DC at the moment. So if we really want to think about some of the reasons and whether that might change for the next year, really unclear who's going to take the lead for Trump's invitation and really be the shepherd in the U.S. government to make that happen. So President Trump has abandoned much of Obama's pivot, as John Titinan has indicated. We see now Trump's free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think it's clear to acknowledge that this is really a response to many actions of China, particularly in the South China Sea and issues related to the Belt and Road Initiative, such as corruption that enriches elites but leaves unsustainable debts for the citizens to repay, or as in the Sri Lankan case, where Sri Lanka was forced to hand over or to sign a 99-year lease and hand over the strategically located Hambawada port to China. Suspicions that the BRI was not just focused on on infrastructure and connectivity, but also a statecraft designed using economic leverage for strategic purposes. So if we look at many of the principles in the free and open Indo-Pacific, they're clearly designed to set up a distinction between the US and China. So free is freedom from coercion versus China's use of force in the South China Sea, freedom of navigation versus potential anti-access denial strategies by China and being required to request Chinese permission for passage through the South China Sea, a rules-based order rather than a might versus right order, and free trade rather than predatory economics and debt trap diplomacy, which have been some of the buzzwords that US officials have used. So clearly, on its face, many of the principles of the free and open Indo-Pacific are fully consistent with those of ASEAN norms of freedom, openness, etc., and in the interest, one can argue, of the Southeast Asian states. But as has been indicated, there has been pushback against the US free and open Indo-Pacific, and ASEAN has in fact adopted the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Why is this the case? Number one, because, as I indicated earlier, National Security Strategy 2017 labeled China a peer competitor, and the 2018 National Defense Strategy claimed that China's aim is to establish hegemony and to place the US. In this context of zero-sum diplomacy, the free and open Indo-Pacific was clearly viewed as a means to counter China, and therefore associating with it risked being perceived in Beijing as associating with the US vis-a-vis China. And again, that is not a choice that any Southeast Asian country wants to make. So in the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, we see a principle of inclusiveness, which is designed, of course, to signal openness and inclusiveness to China. We also see opposition because the free and open Indo-Pacific was unveiled almost simultaneously with the Quad, the US, Australia, Japan, India strategic dialogue, which many Southeast Asians viewed as bringing outside powers into the region, something that raised the prospects of Southeast Asian states losing autonomy over the region. And although many US officials have gone out of their way to reiterate that ASEAN centrality is key to the free and open Indo-Pacific, that has not been received fully in Southeast Asia, so they are wary. Many Southeast Asian states are also wary of embracing the free and open Pacific because, quite frankly, when originally pronounced, it was more of a vision than a real strategy, and one can argue it's still in the process of becoming a strategy. When we see what is the US doing in an attempt to ensure freedom of navigation, which, as I indicated, is the most vital US interest, we see the US really asserting its right to, quote unquote, fly, sail, and operate anywhere in the world that international law permits by freedom of navigation exercises, which are directed against what the US views as excessive maritime claims. Many Southeast Asian states have been wary of US phone ops for a number of reasons. First, they raise tensions with China, which views them as antithetical to Chinese interests, illegal and provocative. China has repeatedly said that US claims that they're doing this to keep these waters open for freedom of commerce are not fully believable because China has never threatened to close these lanes to commerce. The US retort is that freedom of navigation is based on international law, on a principle, on a right, not on somebody's permission. We also see opposition in part because they raise tensions with China. China has very often mobilized physical responses, and we've seen quite a number of near misses where US and Chinese planes or ships have resulted in some very dangerous encounters. This raises the risk of a physical confrontation, which could escalate with unpredictable consequences. Moreover, and fundamentally, there's a divergence of interests between the US and the Southeast Asian states, right? the key U.S. interest is freedom of navigation through the waters. Key U.S. interest of Southeast Asian states is protection of national sovereignty to territory and the right to exploit resources in their EEZs. And freedom of navigation operations do virtually nothing to help ensure the security of territory or rights to the EEZ, didn't help with Scarborough Shoal, have not helped Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, I think, one of the key differences, that there is not a concerted strategy of the U.S. towards Southeast Asia, or sorry, towards the South China Sea, rather a tactic. We also see freedom of coercion, so we see the U.S. with significant maritime security initiative to build capacity. That is very welcome in Southeast Asia. We see joint exercises, and recently we see a strong economic component through the quote-unquote BuildAct and the new Development Finance Corporation for Development Finance. As you know, as a free market economy, the U.S. simply doesn't have state-owned enterprises or state-owned banks that can meet the Chinese challenge with regard to infrastructure and investment. The BuildAct, which is better utilization of investments leading to development, is significant because it's a wholesale restructuring of U.S. development finance. It totals $60 billion. For the first time ever, the U.S. will not be able not only to make loans, provide technical expertise, et cetera, but also to make limited equity investments to reduce the risk for private and other agencies. This has never happened before, and it's clearly directed to help compete with Southeast Asia. So if that's the U.S. side, what do we see in terms of options for the Southeast Asian states? Okay, I'm having technical difficulties. All right, well, while we get it figured out, let me just say that we can think of kind of three broad strategies, right? States can balance against a threat, they can bandwagon with a rising power, or they can try to hedge their bets, right? And Southeast Asian states face a mix of competing incentives as they try to choose between these alternatives. Balancing will occur when you face a high-level threat. You'll ask questions such as, do you have allies? Can you balance independently, et cetera, et cetera? Balancing is costly, not only in terms of potential loss of blood and treasure, but because you're going to expect retaliation from whoever you're balancing against. As a result, we really don't see much balancing in Southeast Asia. The only case we really see is Aquino in the Philippines, taking China to the International UNCLOS Tribunal, even under strong pressure from China not to multilateralize the case. We do see, of course, as you all know, that judgment coming out in the Philippine favor, but it came out a few weeks after Duterte took over from Aquino, and he reversed course, arguing that the Philippines couldn't win a war against China. It needed Chinese investment, and hence he was going to have a rapprochement with China. So that is the only case. We also see that states can bandwagon with a rising power. Arguably, we see that in the case of Cambodia, in part because of geography, size, distance. We see Cambodia almost completely dependent on China economically. We see China controlling about 50% of Cambodia's coastline, and as we all know, reports that there is an agreement between China and Cambodia on military bases. Both sides have denied it, but there's currently construction for deep-water ports and airports large enough for military planes. We also see, well short of balancing, a lot of resistance against certain Chinese actions. Obviously, we see this in the South China Sea by Vietnam over fishing bans, over the oil rigs that have been placed there. We clearly see it by Indonesia pushing back over China's claims to the Natuna EEZ. We see that opposition to the BRI has become a political issue in some countries. We saw it be used to mobilize votes effectively in both the Indonesian and the Malaysian elections. We see that after Mahathir's win in Malaysia, he threatens to cancel the Eastern Railway project, and only has it go forward after China agrees to cut the price by a third. So we do see this very complementary mix of strategies among the Southeast Asian states. Obviously, hedging would be, as has been said, the preferred strategy of Southeast Asian countries. And what we see, according to one 2008 survey of over 1,000 Southeast Asian foreign policy elites, is that 45% believe that China would become a revisionist power with the intent to turn Southeast Asia into its sphere of influence. The same survey also showed that 68% had little confidence in the U.S. ability as a security partner. This, of course, means that it's becoming harder to hedge for Southeast Asian states. And obviously, there's clearly a lot of things that Australia, Japan, and other countries in the region can do. But since my brief was kind of to focus on the U.S., I am not going to talk about that. All right. Prospect for the future. To conclude, where might things go? Obviously, I think there's going to be four kind of key factors that are going to drive this, right? What is China going to do? If China escalates in the South China Sea, perhaps by imposing an air defense identification zone, that is clearly going to ratchet up Sino-US tensions. And it will presumably may ratchet up tensions with many Southeast Asian countries as well. That's clearly an unknown. Another question is whether China is going to accommodate some Southeast Asian interests in order to change some of these perceptions about potential revisionist behavior. At the second BRI summit earlier this spring that was attended by all 10 ASEAN leaders, there were 9. Jokowi would have attended, but it was right after the election, and so he didn't, because the results were not out. We see that China does make a series of pledges to address some of the concerns that have been leveled against the BRI. President Xi pledged to reform it in a number of ways, including by enhancing transparency, working more closely with multilateral development banks on specific projects, adopting international best practices, et cetera, et cetera. If it does accommodate Southeast Asian interests, then again, these perceptions might change. Another key issue is going to be Southeast Asian domestic politics. We clearly see huge changes in policy when you have new leaders like Duterte or Mahathir. So that's going to be an issue. And some reports on a global basis have shown that countries that have free presses and free and fair elections are much more likely to scrutinize BRI projects and economic and infrastructure projects, not just from China, but from all countries around the world, which indicates that we're likely to see more evaluation of that in countries with at least free and fair elections and a free press. With that regard, the kind of democratic backsliding that we're seeing in Southeast Asia does not necessarily bode well. I haven't really talked about ASEAN because I understood that that was going to be Kungawi's writ. But one game changer could be if ASEAN could get its act together, agree on a kind of common strategic platform on critical issues such as the South China Sea, water in the Mekong, and policy towards the great powers. We saw that decades ago. We haven't seen it in I just put it out there because that could be a potential change for the region. Finally, what do we see from the U.S.? There's no doubt in my mind that most Southeast Asian countries, what they want from the U.S. is a long-term strategic policy that recognizes the significant economic, geostrategic interest that the U.S. has and that is implemented stably over time. Quite frankly, it's difficult to envision that as long as Trump is president. We all know he makes policy by Twitter. He's fairly unpredictable. His transactional policy does not bode well for that. And given the impeachment hearings and an upcoming election, it's hard to see a change in the next year. But I do want to say, because I want to end on an optimistic note, that what we are seeing in Washington, at least among members of the think tank community, is a recognition that even at the height of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union found lots of ways to cooperate on specific issues, and that this zero-sum rhetoric vis-a-vis China is unproductive and antithetical to US interests. There is also an argument beginning to be made that pressuring the Southeast Asian states to choose is not in the US interest, because given economic projections, geographic proximity, et cetera, they might not choose the United States. Therefore, an argument is being put forward that is what is in the U.S. interest is helping to create the conditions for a stronger, more resilient Southeast Asia through capacity building and investment so that they can pursue their own interests in strategic autonomy independently. I think this is a strategy that would be useful or welcome in Southeast Asia. One can argue that parts of the free and open Indo-Pacific are moving in that direction, and I hope that that view gets more traction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Murphy. Very rich presentation. A number of good points I would like to highlight, but I'll just mention a few. First, I think 2015, when President Xi Jinping, he actually mentioned that the artificial islands would not be weaponized, but these have been weaponized. And the fact that the weaponization of the artificial islands, I think, has left a bad taste among US policymakers. Is something that we overlook. The harder to hedge, I think that's a very good point. I mean, there's some bandwagoning. Cambodia, balancing is difficult, and also hedging is also harder. The fact that the US is so polarized in a visceral fashion, I think, makes it, to the outside, to us, in the outside world, it makes the US unreliable. A good point about domestic political regimes. Domestic politics is consequential for regional relations, international relations. I think the more domestic political regimes in Southeast Asia reverge, slide into authoritarianism, this plays more into China's hand than the rest, the US and the West. To what extent, and I'm going to leave it here until for our next speaker, we're interested in, you talk about Obama. I mean, Obama is very popular on many levels, but his geostrategy here, the pivot rebalance, did not succeed. And I think that people have been disappointed among think tanks, academics, analysts with the Obama doctrine, if you will, pivot rebalance, because during that time, China has kind of taken over the South China Sea, more or less, without contest. And when there was contest from the Philippines, nothing happened, even though the Philippines won a almost unanimous decision verdict from the Permanent Court of Arbitration in July 2016. So domestic politics matters. To what extent are we talking about just Obama and Trump, or are we talking about the US ship of state, the whole country? This is a whole government. Are they moving in this direction anyway? To what extent are we seeing this as a bipartisan issue? The US posture and policy and practice in Southeast Asia is not just Trump, it's not just Obama, it's the kind of the ship of state turning, reorienting this way, more domestically focused, very polarized at home, and then pushing back against China to a degree, but a lot of domestic constraints. So we move to the next speaker, who is also an author. I want to mention the book, Benjamin Zawacki has written a book about Thailand being between China and the US. It's called Shifting Ground Between the US and a Rising China. Thailand is a key kind of litmus test for U.S.-China rivalry in geopolitical competition, because Thailand is a U.S. treaty ally. It's a U.S. treaty ally, but it's very close to China. I also noticed, when Xi Jinping does something with Thailand, like excluding Prime Minister Prayut from the first Belt and Road Forum, the resentment or the kind of ill feeling towards China very limited. When the U.S. does something that's perceived to be against the Thai government or Thailand, such as considering cutting the remaining GSP privileges, a lot of outcry against the U.S. And even though Trump invited and hosted General Prayut for a visit on October 2nd, 2017 at the White House. So Trump, as opposed to Obama, has been very friendly to the Prayut government. But nevertheless, when the U.S. announces this GSP, for example, GSP cutoff, a lot of outcry in Thailand. So it's almost like China gets away with a bit more, U.S. less, even though Thailand is a U.S. treaty ally. What do you think, Benjamin? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's an honor to be with all of you, and a particular honor to be sharing the dais today with these other panelists. He's long gone now, but there was a famous American baseball player in the 20th century who was known for his gaffes and his sort of unintentionally interesting quotes. And he once said to the media before a big game that, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And as an analyst, I tend to sort of trade in predictions, but rather unusually than today, I think I'd like to focus primarily on dilemmas and on what I see as the options for Southeast Asia in the coming months and years. And if and as time permits, say something about prospects as well, perhaps during the questions and answer session. It's also something I've been working on toward a future publication in terms of how I think these dilemmas and options will play out over the course of the next year or so. Let's start with dilemmas. The first dilemma, I think, facing Southeast Asian countries is that political tension and economic dependency are always an uneasy marriage. This is to say that most ASEAN nations find themselves in political tension with either the United States or China, while at the same time being increasingly economically dependent on one or both powers. This dependency, in turn, places political constraints on what they can do domestically and internationally. Of course, the level and nature of this tension varies depending on each nation's general political alignment with either the US and China, and on its level of trade and investment with those countries. But the dilemma and the question is, how do you maintain your political agility and autonomy with respect to national elections, the South China Sea, cybersecurity, you name it, when your economy is so beholden to one or both of the great powers? The second dilemma facing Southeast Asia. The US and China are competing on the basis of both interests and values, on the basis of both physical space and on how such space should be governed. This creates domestic dilemmas within Southeast Asian countries that manifest themselves in their foreign policies. The most ready example of this is the Philippines, where President Duterte has generally moved the country away from the United States and closer to China in matters of both interest and values, while at the same time the Philippine military has generally resisted this move. Or take Thailand, the other US treaty ally in the region. Earlier this year, its growing affinity for a model of governance more similar to China's than America's at least partially gave way, via its first election in 5 years, to a desire for a more full restoration of military opportunities with the United States. The third, and I think the most critical dilemma facing Southeast Asian nations is this. For ASEAN, there's an inherent tension between its desire for centrality and its fear of actually being central in the most important geopolitical dynamic of our time between the US and China. ASEAN justifies its claim to centrality on the basis of geography, sitting, as it does, at the very center of the Indo-Pacific region. But when it comes to US-China dynamics, it relegates itself to the periphery. Centrality suggests a proactive leader-like posture, Yet ASEAN's actual position is inherently defensive. Don't make us make decisions. Don't ask us to leverage our position. Don't put us between the two of you. Yet the result of racing toward the margins of a situation is that you end up, well, marginal. And this holds for individual nations as well in Southeast Asia. They expect the US and China to compete for their attention on the basis of where they're situated on the map, but not so much attention that they are asked to reciprocate too much in one direction or the other. Furthermore, for individual member states of ASEAN, this tension is not sustainable, which only compounds the dilemma. Consider, for example, Thailand's much vaunted, but I would argue largely mythical, quote-unquote, bamboo diplomacy, whereby it is credited for swaying with the prevailing political winds historically, including between the US and China during the Cold War, so as to always be on the right side. Yet, bamboo trees do not in and of themselves sway in anticipation of a wind. They are forced by those winds in one direction or another. In other words, hedging, balancing, neutrality is its own vulnerability. And finally, as a kind of analog to this dilemma, is one confronting not Southeast Asian countries, but confronting the US and China. And that is that for both the US and China, there is a self-imposed tension, even a contradiction, between their words and their actions in Southeast Asia, between their written and spoken policies on the one hand, and their policies put into practice on the other. In particular, this pertains to whether the competition between them in Southeast Asia constitutes a zero-sum scenario. Both the US and China repeatedly, even stridently, claim that it is not a zero-sum dynamic, that they are not seeking to advance their interests and values at the expense of the other, and that they are not asking, much less forcing, ASEAN or its member states to choose between them. On the other hand, there is growing recognition in Beijing and Washington alike that in many cases, and perhaps in most, a nation cannot have it both ways. It cannot have two security allies if a kinetic conflict breaks out between those same two allies. It cannot award an exclusive oil or natural gas concession to more than one bidder. It cannot be a signatory and a non-signatory to the same treaty. And it cannot send a political dissident to both a country of asylum and back to his country of persecution. Yet, having publicly disavowed a zero-sum approach and asking Southeast Asian nations to choose between them, the US and China are either constrained in their actions and forfeit their interest to the other, or they act in their interest while in so doing revealing that their policies claiming otherwise have been articulated in poor faith. Either way they lose, be it in their relations with one another or with Southeast Asia. I'd like to shift, if I could, to options. And by options, I don't mean exact policy paths that Southeast Asia might follow in the coming months and years, but rather an outline of the factors and facts that they must consider. And some of this will recall what Anne-Marie has eloquently already articulated. I do this from the vantage point of a hypothetical Southeast Asian leader, one who is both chief executive of her country, but also serves as a kind of empowered, muscular Secretary General of ASEAN. She therefore knows Southeast Asia inside and out. She's an expert on the region, but has fallen 6 to 8 years behind or so on the US and China. This would be the 10-minute briefing I would give her. We'll consider the US side of the ledger first, followed by China's side, and beginning with economics. On the US side, you have, first and foremost, a trade war. Of course, for some Southeast Asian countries, trade diversion and foreign investment as a result of the war has conferred some benefits. Vietnam's exports to the US are up, for example, while elements of Malaysia's, Indonesia's, and the Philippines' economies are benefiting as well. Singapore, in contrast, is taking an appreciable hit. In addition to the trade war, in May 2019, the US added Singapore and Malaysia to its watch list for potential currency manipulation. For his part, Trump recently referred to Vietnam as, quote, the single worst abuser of everybody. Thailand narrowly escaped the watch list, but runs an increasing trade surplus with the United States. And last month, as has been mentioned, the U.S. announced it would punitively retract over $1 billion worth of Thailand's general system of preferences privilege over long, lingering labor issues. On the China side, the trade war, regardless of its background and its roots, is generally seen within Southeast Asia as a war of choice by the U.S. China has been the biggest trading partner with ASEAN for 10 years. In 2019, ASEAN itself rose to second place among China's trading partners and saw its FTA with China upgraded. And last month, Thailand and China discussed a Chinese investment headquarters in Bangkok to assist it in distributing goods within mainland Southeast Asia. Further on the economic front, under the Trump administration, the U.S. has been increasingly protectionist and in favor only of bilateral trade deals. In 2017, as has been mentioned, it left the TPP, which would have been the world's biggest trade deal, covering almost 40% of global GDP. In 2018, an amended version of the TPP did come into effect and included 4 ASEAN countries. The U.S. has also been attacking the World Trade Organization's appellate dispute body, which has resulted in Southeast Asian victories over the years, as when Thailand prevailed over the U.S. on the issue of compulsory licensing for certain pharmaceuticals. On a more productive note, in 2018, the U.S. launched Asia Edge, a whole-of-government approach to support energy security, catalyze private sector investment in energy markets, and help partners to set transparent and market-based energy policies. On the China side, of course, it initiated the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which, assuming India eventually comes on board, will be a 16-member deal for half the world's population and about 1/3 of global GDP. All 10 ASEAN states are members. Geopolitically, the Trump administration has introduced the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, and just earlier this week released a second report on that vision. This past August, the U.S. and 32 other Indo-Pacific countries held a Chief of Defense conference in Bangkok. This marked an uptick from only 6 countries who attended this conference in 2016. ASEAN, of course, responded to the free and open Indo-Pacific vision with its own outlook, albeit a very anodyne one. The U.S. is also the main driver behind the Quad, made up of Australia, India, Japan, and the U.S. This past September, they met for the first time at the ministerial level, which is something that the Indians had been reluctant to do prior to then. Last month, while speaking at the Heritage Institute in Washington, D.C., Secretary of State Pompeo described the Quad for the first time as, quote, security talks that will prove very important in the efforts ahead, ensuring that China retains only its proper place in the world. Also in September, the U.S. Congress debated a new Southeast Asia Strategy Act that will, quote, deepen U.S. engagement with our Southeast Asian partners by requiring the administration to develop and communicate a coherent strategy that addresses all aspects of the partnership, from trade and humanitarian goals to diplomatic and security arrangements. China's side of the geopolitical ledger, of course, is dominated by the Belt Road Initiative, which now includes over 130 countries globally. Its Southeast Asia section is part of a maritime Silk Road, offering infrastructure and other connectivity on an unprecedented scale and scope. Critics do deride debt traps, rights traps, and the potential use of deep water ports, in particular for military uses. In a January 2019 survey of elite opinion in ASEAN, conducted by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, 47% of respondents, including 51% in Thailand, said that the BRI will, quote, bring ASEAN member states closer into China's orbit. What was not clear, however, was whether such was expressed with approval or apprehension. In the South China Sea, where China has disputes with 5 ASEAN nations, the U.S. response has been 11 freedom of navigation patrols in the last 3 years since Trump took office. This contrasts with only 6 patrols under 8 years of President Obama. For its part, China has since 2013 constructed more than 3,000 acres across 7 features in the sea, artificial islands, pursuant to its expansive 9-dash line. And as Anne-Marie mentioned, those artificial islands have been fairly heavily militarized. On the Mekong River, which some see as mainland Southeast Asia's equivalent of the South China Sea, the United States Lower Mekong Initiative is still seen within the region, despite recent efforts to reinvigorate it, as lacking inadequate resources and activity. In September this year, however, the US Congress said that at least $25 million of a potential Countering Chinese Influence Fund would be, quote, made available for assistance for Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam for a law enforcement and counter transnational crime program on the Mekong River. On the China side, in 2015, it founded the powerful Lansong Mekong Cooperation Forum, fully funded and run out of Beijing, and which views the Mekong as both a river and a sub-regional economic zone. However, China's construction of dams, dredging of the riverbed, and blasting of 10 of 11 rapids locations, as well as over 80 joint security patrols since 2019 in parts of the Mekong outside of China, have seen Beijing blamed for droughts and floods in downstream countries. Earlier this year, in fact, water levels of the Mekong reached their lowest levels ever recorded. From a resource standpoint, in 2018, the U.S. passed, as Anne-Marie mentioned, the Better Utilization of Investment Leading to Development Act, or the BUILD Act, which is mentioned in the Free and Open Indo-Pacific reports, and it does create a new lending agency of some $60 billion. In December of last year, a new Asia Reassurance Initiative Act was designed to increase U.S. security and economic interests in East and Southeast Asia. Its authorization, however, is a mere $1.5 billion. And in this past September, a few months ago, the aforementioned Countering Chinese Influence Fund would be worth a mere $375 million. In contrast, China's Belt Road Initiative is funded to the tune of a projected $1.1 trillion. On the cyber front, a new U.S.-ASEAN cybersecurity dialogue took place last month, but the U.S. has remained unable to present Southeast Asia with a 5G alternative to China's Huawei, which the U.S. opposes. For its part, just last Sunday, China said it was ready to roll out 5G via Huawei over Southeast Asia. Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand have welcomed the company. Vietnam has rejected it. Singapore is seeking a balance. Concerning soft power, U.S. brands and products remain enormously powerful, profitable, and popular across Southeast Asia. Facebook, Starbucks, Nike, Hollywood, Nicki Minaj. On China's side, its Confucius Institutes have proliferated across the region, with more in Thailand, in fact, than in the whole of Southeast Asia combined, the whole of the rest of Southeast Asia combined. Diplomatically, the U.S. lacks ambassadors to ASEAN, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore, all allies. It also chose, and I confess to having struggled last night with a diplomatically suitable phrasing here, to send an astonishing low-ranking and low-profile representation to the recent ASEAN and East Asia summits. The aforementioned survey of elite opinion in Southeast Asia also found that 68% of respondents overall and 73% of Thais felt that the U.S. engagement with ASEAN under Trump has deteriorated. And that survey, mind you, was this past January and not this past Monday. China has fully accredited ambassadors across the region, while Premier Li Keqiang brought gravitas, stature, credibility, and sheer power to the summits last weekend. And finally, in the values race, our hypothetical Southeast Asian leader would note that the U.S. under Trump has substantially scaled back its funding and focus on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in Southeast Asia, having issued a late and muted response, for example, to the situation of the Rohingya in Western Myanmar. Beijing, for its part, can confidently count at least 5 countries in the region as having adopted the China model of authoritarian capitalism. with two others leaning heavily in that direction. Under Trump, the U.S. also denies climate change in its foreign policy, having officially left the Paris Agreement earlier this week, while China at least pledges a leading role globally and within the most valuable region of the world, namely South and Southeast Asia. In the interest of time, I will defer the prospects element of the dilemmas, options, and prospects part of this panel, either to the Q&A session or to a piece I'm working on now and hope to have published before the end of the year. But I welcome any questions, and thank you so much for your attention.